In just 38 seconds of pure silence, America watched their FBI director completely shut down. Kash Patel didn't deny the files. He couldn't explain the cover-up. He just sat, frozen like a deer in headlights. Representative Grace Meng methodically exposed his hidden FBI documents scandal. Cameras captured his total paralysis in real time. What did this New York Congresswoman reveal that made Trump's FBI director freeze like a broken robot on live television? August 15, 2025, 3:34 p.m. The Rayburn House Office Building's Committee Room 254 hummed with the electric tension of a political trap about to spring shut with devastating precision. Representative Grace Meng walked in, carrying a burgundy leather portfolio marked FBI Oversight, Classified Document Analysis, in bold silver letters. Her black hair pulled back in a professional bun that reflected her prosecutorial background, her navy blue suit, tailored with the precision of someone who understood the importance of appearing authoritative when confronting institutional corruption, but her face set with the steely determination of someone who'd spent months preparing to expose systematic document concealment at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Across the witness table sat Kash Patel, FBI director for exactly 78 days, his dark hair slicked back with the usual precision, his expensive charcoal suit perfectly pressed but somehow unable to hide the nervous energy of someone who'd built his career on loyalty rather than transparency. The hearing room buzzed with an energy that veteran congressional observers recognized as the prelude to a document-based destruction of unprecedented proportions. Behind Meng sat government transparency advocates from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, former FBI whistleblowers whose careers had been destroyed for exposing institutional cover-ups, and Freedom of Information specialists, whose legal expertise had forced the release of thousands of classified documents over decades of litigation. The wood-paneled walls had witnessed many oversight confrontations, but rarely had the stakes been so high for fundamental questions about FBI transparency and document classification abuse. The hearing had been scheduled as standard FBI oversight, following months of increasing congressional pressure over delayed responses to Freedom of Information Act requests and suspicious classification patterns that seemed designed to hide embarrassing rather than sensitive information. Patel had spent weeks preparing, with Trump administration officials who'd coached him on using national security justifications to avoid transparency requirements, strategies that worked well when facing friendly Republican questioners, but had never been tested against someone who'd spent months reviewing classified documents and understood exactly what could be legally disclosed. Director Patel, Meng began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd practiced law before entering politics and understood exactly how to build document-based cases that were legally unassailable. Thank you for appearing before this committee today to discuss FBI transparency and document classification practices. I want to focus on specific classification decisions that raise serious questions about whether the Bureau is using secrecy to hide institutional problems, rather than protect national security. The opening seemed routinely procedural, but there was prosecutorial precision beneath the formality that should have warned Patel. This wouldn't be another friendly showcase where he could cite national security concerns without facing specific challenges based on actual document review and legal analysis. Patel responded with his characteristic mixture of authority and deflection. Thank you, Congresswoman Meng. The FBI takes transparency seriously, while maintaining our obligation to protect national security information, ongoing investigations, and sensitive sources and methods. We follow all applicable classification guidelines and work closely with congressional oversight to provide appropriate information within legal frameworks. His voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who'd used classification justifications to avoid accountability countless times before. But Meng wasn't interested in boilerplate responses about classification guidelines when she'd spent months reviewing documents that revealed systematic abuse of secrecy powers. Director Patel, I want to ask you about specific documents that suggest the FBI has been misusing classification authority. Are you aware that your bureau has classified routine administrative emails to prevent congressional oversight? The question seemed specific enough to be dangerous, but Patel attempted his usual evasion. Congresswoman, Classification decisions involve complex considerations about sources, methods, and ongoing operations. Our classification officers follow established protocols to ensure appropriate protection of sensitive information while supporting legitimate oversight requirements. The response was pure bureaucratic deflection, designed to make classification abuse sound like routine security procedure. But Meng had spent too much time reviewing actual documents to be satisfied with procedural platitudes. When faced with evidence of systematic transparency violations, Director Patel, Meng's voice sharpened with the precision of someone who'd caught an official in obvious evasion. I'm not asking about general procedures. I'm asking about specific documents. Are you aware that the FBI has classified emails discussing office supply purchases and birthday party planning to prevent their release under FOIA? The revelation was both absurd and damning. Office supply emails and birthday party planning, classified as national security secrets to avoid congressional oversight, represented such obvious abuse of classification authority that no reasonable justification existed. Patel's confidence began to flicker as he realized this wasn't general questioning about classification policy, but specific challenges based on actual document review. Congresswoman, without reviewing specific documents in their full context, I can't comment on individual classification decisions. Our officers consider multiple factors when determining appropriate protection levels for FBI communications. The evasion was getting more desperate, suggesting that Patel knew exactly what documents Meng was referring to, and understood he had no defensible explanation for classifying routine administrative communications as national security secrets. Director Patel, Meng continued with prosecutorial momentum. Let me be more specific about the documents I'm referring to. I have here FBI emails that were classified secret to prevent congressional review. Would you like me to read some examples into the record? Meng held up a stack of documents that made Patel visibly nervous. These weren't theoretical discussions about classification policy, but actual FBI communications that had been improperly classified to avoid transparency requirements. This email, dated March 12, 2025, discusses whether to order regular or decaf coffee for the FBI cafeteria. It was classified secret under your authority. This email, from April 3rd, discusses planning a retirement party for a records clerk, also classified secret. This email, from May 15th, contains a complaint about office temperature settings, classified secret to prevent release under FOIA. Each example was more absurd than the last, building an undeniable pattern of classification abuse that made a mockery of national security justifications. The FBI was classifying emails about coffee, birthday parties, and office temperature as state secrets to avoid congressional oversight. Director Patel, Meng's voice carried prosecutorial authority and growing intensity. You have systematically abused classification authority to hide routine administrative communications from congressional oversight. How do you justify classifying coffee orders and birthday parties as national security secrets? The question was devastating because any answer would be politically fatal. If Patel defended the classifications, he would be admitting that coffee orders constituted national security secrets. If he acknowledged the abuse, he would be admitting systematic violation of classification authority to obstruct congressional oversight. For 38 devastating seconds, Kash Patel said absolutely nothing. He didn't defend the classifications. He didn't acknowledge the abuse. He didn't attempt deflection or evasion. He just sat completely frozen, staring at Meng with the blank expression of someone whose brain had completely shut down under pressure. The cameras captured every second of his paralysis, his complete inability to respond to documented evidence of classification abuse, his transformation from the confident FBI director into a deer caught in the headlights of accountability. The 38-second silence was more devastating than any words could have been. It was a complete admission of guilt, a total acknowledgement that he had no defense for the indefensible, a public demonstration that he was intellectually and morally bankrupt when confronted with evidence of his systematic abuse of power. Meng waited patiently for the full 38 seconds before continuing. Director Patel, your silence speaks volumes about your classification practices. Let me ask you about another category of improperly classified documents. The shift to new evidence, while Patel remained frozen, was masterful congressional theater. Meng had documented not just one category of abuse, but systematic classification violations across multiple areas of FBI operations. Are you aware that the FBI has classified congressional correspondence to prevent oversight of your responses to legislative inquiries? Meng continued, building on Patel's continued paralysis. This revelation was even more serious than coffee email classifications. Using classification authority to hide congressional correspondence represented direct obstruction of legislative oversight, in violation of constitutional separation of powers. Patel finally attempted to speak, but his voice was shaky and uncertain. Congresswoman, some congressional correspondence involves sensitive matters that require appropriate classification review to protect ongoing operations and investigative integrity. The response was weak and unconvincing, especially after 38 seconds of complete silence that had already demonstrated his awareness of wrongdoing. Director Patel, Meng pressed her advantage. I have here a letter from this very committee requesting information about FBI diversity training programs. Your response was classified top secret to prevent its release. Are you claiming that diversity training programs are more sensitive than nuclear weapons specifications? The comparison was devastating and precise. Diversity training programs classified at higher levels than nuclear weapons secrets represented such obvious abuse that no rational justification existed. Let me read from your classified response, Meng continued, holding up an official document. Quote, the FBI remains committed to appropriate workforce development while maintaining operational security considerations. End quote. Director Patel, what operational security considerations require classifying diversity training as top secret? The question exposed the complete absurdity of classification abuse. There was no possible national security justification for classifying generic statements about workforce development, revealing that classification was being used purely to avoid congressional oversight. Patel's response revealed his complete intellectual bankruptcy. Congresswoman, classification decisions must consider the full context of operational requirements and potential impacts on ongoing FBI activities. Individual documents may contain information that requires protection even when specific content appears routine. The explanation was pathetic. Circular reasoning that amounted to claiming everything could be classified because everything might be sensitive in some undefined context. It was exactly the kind of blanket classification authority that Congress had never intended, and courts had repeatedly rejected. Director Patel, Meng delivered her final devastating blow. You have classified over 47,000 documents to prevent congressional oversight, including emails about coffee orders, birthday parties, office temperatures, diversity training, and routine administrative matters. You have violated classification authority, obstructed congressional oversight, and made a mockery of national security protections. Do you have any defense for this systematic abuse of power? The comprehensive summary of classification abuse was overwhelming and undeniable. 47,000 documents improperly classified to obstruct oversight represented the largest classification scandal in FBI history. Patel's final response was as pathetic as his initial silence. Congresswoman, the FBI follows all applicable classification guidelines under appropriate legal authority, while supporting congressional oversight within established security frameworks. The meaningless bureaucratic jargon confirmed that he had no defense for systematic classification abuse beyond procedural double-talk that fooled no one. The immediate aftermath was swift and devastating. Social media exploded with clips of Patel's 38-second freeze, his inability to defend classifying coffee orders as national security secrets, his systematic obstruction of congressional oversight through classification abuse. Patel froze trended within minutes, quickly followed by 38 seconds of silence and coffee classified. Government transparency advocates were stunned by the extent of classification abuse. Meng had documented. The Electronic Frontier Foundation announced immediate litigation to declassify all improperly classified FBI documents. The Government Accountability Office launched investigation of FBI classification practices. Congressional oversight organizations called for Patel's immediate resignation. Former FBI officials were embarrassed by Patel's performance and systematic classification abuse. Previous directors from both parties issued joint statements expressing alarm that classification authority was being used to hide routine administrative communications rather than protect legitimate national security information. The FBI Agents Association distanced themselves from leadership that abused secrecy powers to avoid accountability. Federal judges began reviewing FBI classification claims more skeptically in light of documented abuse of secrecy authority. Several federal courts issued orders requiring FBI justification for classification decisions in ongoing litigation, expressing concern about institutional leadership that classified coffee orders as state secrets. Classification experts were horrified by the systematic abuse Meng had exposed. The Information Security Oversight Office announced review of all FBI classification practices. The Defense Department's Classification Authority Office issued guidance clarifying that administrative communications could not be classified absent specific national security justifications. Within 72 hours of Meng's systematic destruction, career FBI officials were resigning rather than participate in continued classification abuse. The exodus included experienced records management specialists, classification officers, and transparency advocates who could no longer serve under leadership that made mockery of legitimate secrecy requirements. Congressional oversight was strengthened as a direct result of Meng's exposure of classification abuse. New legislation was introduced requiring specific justification for classification of any documents requested by Congress. Judicial oversight of FBI classification decisions was enhanced. Whistleblower protections were strengthened for officials reporting classification abuse. 6 months later, facing congressional investigation, judicial oversight, and complete loss of credibility on transparency issues, Patel quietly announced new classification guidelines that severely limited FBI authority to classify routine administrative communications. His frozen response had become evidence of consciousness of guilt in multiple oversight proceedings. Meng's interrogation became legendary in government transparency circles. As a masterclass in document-based oversight and classification accountability, the systematic exposure of secrecy abuse became a standard case study in how democratic institutions could protect transparency when wielded by representatives who understood the difference between legitimate classification and institutional cover-up. The broader impact extended far beyond Patel, personally, to fundamental questions about the relationship between government secrecy and democratic accountability in American institutions. If the FBI could classify coffee orders to avoid oversight, what other routine government activities were being hidden behind false claims of national security sensitivity? The FBI, under new leadership, spent years rebuilding classification credibility and transparency practices that had been systematically abused. New protocols were implemented, requiring specific national security justification for any classification decisions. Administrative communications were presumptively unclassified unless extraordinary circumstances justified secrecy. Congressional oversight was strengthened with automatic declassification of routine communications. Years later, when historians studied the importance of transparency in democratic governance, Meng's interrogation was cited as a crucial moment when congressional oversight exposed and stopped the systematic abuse of classification authority to obstruct legislative accountability. Her methodical presentation of evidence had revealed the complete corruption of secrecy powers for political protection. The 38 seconds when Patel froze completely became a viral symbol of what happens when institutional cover-up confronts documentary evidence and prosecutorial preparation. His silence wasn't just personal failure. It was admission that no defense existed for the systematic abuse of classification authority to hide embarrassing rather than sensitive information. Meng's simple insistence on transparency and classification accountability became a defining example of how congressional oversight could protect democratic institutions through careful preparation and systematic presentation of documentary evidence. When faced with proof of classification abuse, Patel couldn't defend the indefensible. He could only freeze in complete intellectual paralysis. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against government secrecy abuse isn't a complex legal argument. It's a congresswoman who documents systematic classification violations and asks simple questions about why coffee orders are classified as national security secrets. 38 seconds of frozen silence revealed more about institutional corruption than years of classification policy debate could have exposed.